Right now, like as you're listening to this, you might actually be looking out a window at this perfectly clear, peaceful blue sky.
Right, and it gives us this overwhelming, just comforting illusion of total emptiness. It just looks like a static, quiet vault stretched out over our heads.
Exactly. Like maybe there's a solitary fluffy white cloud drifting by or something, and the whole scene just feels incredibly gentle. You definitely don't look up and think of like violence or heavy machinery or complex planetary engineering.
But the reality, which is, completely hidden from our naked eyes, is that we are actually living at the absolute bottom of a violently churning, incredibly heavy ocean of gas.
Yeah, the atmosphere is definitely not an empty room we just walked through. I
Like,
mean, it is a crushing fluid moving at hundreds of miles an hour in the upper levels, and it's constantly redistributing like millions of megatons of energy.
and that invisible machinery is exactly what we are tearing into today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Our mission today is to unpack these majestic and, frankly, terrifying rivers of air that circulate constantly above our heads. Like, we're going to explore how they literally engineer the Earth's climate on a daily basis and how a deep understanding of these invisible forces actually unlock the modern world as we know it.
We're essentially bridging the gap between planetary physics and human history here. It is just fascinating to look at how the very mechanical turning of the Earth dictated the rise and fall of entire global empires.
It really is. And before we jump in, I really need to emphasize that the entire conceptual framework for today's journey, this brilliant idea of connecting atmospheric physics, extreme modern weather, and maritime history into one grand unified narrative, all this comes directly from a listener named Hathia Third.
It is a phenomenal synthesis of topics, like realizing that you literally can't separate the weather from the history of human civilization. It's all just one giant interlocking mechanism.
So a massive, massive thank you to Hatho Theothot for this thematic connection. I promise you, by the end of this journey, you're going to look up at the sky and view human history completely differently.
I am very much looking forward to getting into the mechanics of this. I mean, knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied, and today we are applying planetary mechanics to human survival.
So we're going to start high up in the atmosphere with the violent forces regulating global temperatures. Then we'll drop down to the surface to examine the gentle but powerful equatorial breezes.
And finally, look at the ancient technology that allowed humanity to hack these winds and basically conquer the globe.
Oh, and as a quick note, per Hathathia's specific design for this deep dive, there will be a rapid-fire 3-minute summary at the very end of our conversation just to lock all this knowledge in, respecting your time.
A perfect way to consolidate everything, for sure. But to kick things off, we really need to establish a foundational concept. The Earth is essentially a giant heat engine trying to fix a massive temperature imbalance.
Right, so we're talking about the crazy contrast between the equator and the poles, basically.
Yes, exactly. So the equator gets pounded by direct, intense sunlight all year round. It is baking hot. And a basic rule of thermodynamics is that hot air expands, it becomes less dense, and it rises.
Which makes sense. Hot air balloon physics, right?
Exactly like a hot air balloon. So you have massive, constant columns of hot air lifting off the equator and pushing high into the upper atmosphere.
Which means, I'm assuming, all that rising air has to leave something behind. Like, it must create a sort of vacuum or an area of really low pressure down at the surface of the equator.
Spot on. It creates a massive low-pressure trough. Nature, as the saying goes, abhors a vacuum. The atmosphere constantly wants to reach a state of thermal equilibrium. Meanwhile, up at the North Pole, you have the exact opposite situation going on.
Because it receives very little direct sunlight, so it is just freezing cold all the time.
Right. And cold air is incredibly dense and heavy, which causes it to sink forcefully toward the surface. So you have heavy air crashing down at the pole and light air lifting up at the equator.
So the atmosphere basically wants to fix this imbalance and share the heat. It wants to fill the gaps.
That is the driving force of all global weather, literally. That hot air that just rose above the equator gets up into the higher atmosphere, looks north, sees the void being created by the shrinking, sinking cold air at the North Pole, and begins to rush northward to fill it.
Okay, so if I'm picturing this in my head, it's just a straight shot. Like the air goes straight up from the equator, takes a hard turn, and flies perfectly straight north to the pole.
Well, if the Earth were a static, non-moving sphere hanging frozen in space, that is exactly what would happen. That air would travel in a perfectly straight, longitudinal line from the equator directly to the North Pole.
But obviously, the Earth is not a static sphere.
No, it is a spinning rock. And we are spinning incredibly fast.
We are rotating from west to east, right?
We are. And this is where a phenomenon called the Coriolis effect comes into play, and it completely alters the flow of our atmosphere. It is the reason we have the westerlies, those relentless, powerful winds constantly blowing from west to east in the mid-latitudes.
Okay, I have to pause you right here because the physics of this always messes with my head. And I want to make sure I really grasp this because it feels counterintuitive to me.
It definitely trips a lot of people up. It's not how we naturally think about motion.
Right, like if I'm on a spinning merry-go-round at a playground and I try to walk from the center out to the edge, I can't walk in a straight line because the floor is moving beneath me.
Exactly.
But if the Earth is spinning west to east, shouldn't the air traveling north essentially lag behind the spinning Earth? Like if the ground is rushing east under it, shouldn't the wind feel like it's blowing to the west? Why does it blow east?
That is the most common misconception, and honestly, it is a completely logical assumption to make based on our everyday experience with things like cars or trains, but we have to look at the math of the planet's waistline.
The waistline.
Yeah, it is all about the varying speeds of rotation at different latitudes. Let's think about the physical circumference of the Earth. At the equator, the Earth is at its absolute widest. It is roughly 24,000 miles all the way around.
Right, it bulges the center. I remember that from grade school.
Now, the Earth completes one full rotation every 24 hours. So for a mountain or a building or just a patch of ocean at the equator, to make that full 24,000-mile journey in a 24-hour period, it has to be moving incredibly fast.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is moving roughly 1,000 miles per hour to the east.
That is staggering when you actually stop to think about it. Like, we are just sitting here, but we are technically rocketing eastward at 1,000 miles an hour right now.
You don't feel it because everything around us, including the atmosphere, is moving at that exact same speed. But as you move north, the geometry of the sphere changes. The Earth gets narrower. Let's say you go up to the latitude of New York City. The circumference around the Earth at that latitude is much, much smaller than at the equator.
But it still takes exactly 24 hours for New York to complete one rotation. Same as the equator.
Yeah,
Because the day is still 24 hours.
exactly. Which means New York has a much shorter distance to travel in that exact same 24-hour window. Because the distance is shorter, the ground up there is moving eastward much slower, maybe around 700 miles per hour instead of 1,000.
Okay, I think I see where this is going at. The air isn't just starting from zero speed.
It definitely isn't. When that hot column of air lifts off the equator, it doesn't just suddenly acquire northward momentum. It already holds onto the eastward momentum it inherited from sitting on the equator. That air is traveling east at 1,000 miles per hour.
Right.
As it starts moving north, high in the atmosphere, it passes over land that is only moving east at 900 miles per hour, then 800, then 700 miles per hour.
Oh, it's outrunning the ground beneath it.
That is exactly it. It is trying to go straight north, but because it is carrying that high-speed equatorial eastward momentum, it is suddenly moving faster to the east than the Earth below it.
So from the perspective of someone standing on the ground in New York, or the mid-latitudes generally, that northward moving air gets deflected to its right. It curves sharply to the east.
Yes. This deflection is the Coriolis effect. And because this deflection is constant, by the time that northward moving air reaches the mid-latitudes around 30 to 60 degrees north, it has been bent so far to the right that it is no longer moving north at all.
It's just going sideways.
Right. It is blowing almost entirely from west to east. These are the permanent westerlies. They are the upper atmospheric rivers that dictate the weather for most of North America, Europe, and Asia.
It is wild to think that a wind pattern thousands of miles away from the equator is driven by the physical speed of the Earth's waistline. I mean, that's mind-blowing.
And this creates a fascinating loop known as a Hadley cell. The air from the equator moves north, gets deflected east into the westerlies, cools down as it loses its tropical heat, and eventually becomes heavy enough to drop back toward the surface in the subtropics.
And once it hits the surface, it needs somewhere to go. So it gets sucked back southward toward that low-pressure vacuum at the equator.
Exactly, completing a massive continuous atmospheric conveyor belt. And millions of people interact with this exact physical phenomenon every single day without realizing it.
I'm immediately thinking of commercial aviation.
Aviation is highly dependent on this. Every time a pilot charts a flight from New York to London, they deliberately seek out the core of these westerlies. They steer the aircraft right into this high-altitude river of air.
Which is why flying to Europe is significantly faster than the agonizingly long return trip back to the States. You are literally surfing the Coriolis effect. The plane is hitching a ride on the differential rotational speed of the planet.
That is a great way to visualize it. You are literally borrowing energy from the Earth's spin to cut your travel time. But we need to look closer at these westerlies because they don't flow in a neat, perfect, predictable circle like a painted line on a highway.
Right, because the Earth's surface is incredibly messy. We have massive obstacles, like mountains.
We do. The westerlies are interacting with a highly complex topography. You have the immense friction of massive mountain ranges, like the Himalayas and the Rockies, poking high into the atmosphere and disrupting the flow.
Kind of like rocks in a river causing rapids.
Perfect analogy. You also have vast temperature differences between the land masses and the oceans, which heat and cool at totally different rates. And on top of all that, the strength of the Coriolis effect itself changes depending on your latitude. It is weakest near the equator and becomes strongest near the poles.
Because the change in the Earth's rotational speed gets much more extreme the further north you go. The circumference shrinks drastically up near the Arctic.
That is correct. So all these competing forces, friction, temperature gradients, and the strengthening Coriolis effect mean the westerlies can't maintain a straight band. Instead, they get distorted. They start to snake and undulate into massive serpentine waves that wrap all the way around the planet.
Okay, so it looks like a wavy snake wrapping around the globe.
Yes. The core, high-speed rivers of air within these wavy westerlies are what we call the jet stream. And the massive atmospheric waves they form are officially called Rossby waves.
So if the jet stream is this wavy, snaking river of air high up in the atmosphere, how does that translate to the weather we actually experience down here on the ground? I mean, I check my weather app, and I don't see Rossby waves. I just see if I need a jacket.
Right. The app simplifies it. The best way to understand the jet stream's impact on our daily weather is to think of it as a planetary fence, a containment field, essentially.
A fence keeping what in?
Cold air. When the temperature difference between the freezing Arctic and the hot equator is very strong, which is how the Earth has historically operated for human history, the jet stream flows incredibly fast. And when a fluid flows very fast, those Rossby waves become small and tight. The flow remains relatively circular and locked around the pole.
Let me see if I can picture this. Is it similar to the physics of a spinning top? Like when you first pull the string and the top is spinning incredibly fast, it stands perfectly upright. The rotation is tight, centered, and highly stable. There is almost no wobble at all.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Yes, a fast, tight jet stream acts exactly like a stable spinning top or a strong barbed wire fence. It effectively traps all that brutally frigid, heavy, dense air up in the Arctic.
So it literally fences the cold air in.
It locks the polar vortex in the north where it belongs. Because that fence is holding strong, the mid-latitudes remain perfectly stable. You get the engine that drives the speed of the jet stream is the temperature contrast between the hot equator and the cold pole. But we are currently seeing a phenomenon called Arctic amplification.
Because of global climate change, the Arctic is warming up, right?
Eh?
But why is it called amplification? Is it warming faster than the rest of the planet?
Significantly faster. The Arctic is warming at nearly 4 times the rate of the global average.
4 times, wow.
Yeah, it's extreme. Part of this is due to the loss of sea ice. White ice naturally reflects sunlight back into space, keeping the region cold. But as the ice melts, it exposes the dark ocean water, which instead absorbs the sun's heat. This creates a really vicious feedback loop, rapidly heating the Arctic.
So the extreme temperature gap between the North Pole and the equator is shrinking. The gradient is flattening out.
The planetary engine is losing its fuel. As that temperature difference narrows, the jet stream loses its high-speed velocity. And returning to your spinning top analogy, what happens when a top slows down?
It loses its stability. It starts to wobble wildly. The tight circular shape completely breaks down, and the top starts swinging aggressively from side to side before it eventually falls over.
That is precisely what is happening to our atmospheric fence. The jet stream starts slithering wildly north and south. The Rossby waves become massively amplified. Instead of a tight, protective circle, you get these incredibly deep troughs that plunge far to the south and incredibly high ridges that bulge far to the north.
Oh, so the fence is broken. The cold air is no longer contained.
Exactly. And the real-world consequences of this broken fence are something we are all seeing on the evening news. Let's break down what happens when the jet stream wobbles into one of those deep troughs.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
When a trough takes a massive dive southward, it creates an open gate. Unimaginably freezing, dense Arctic air, which should have been securely locked at the pole, suddenly spills southward. It floods into regions that are geographically and infrastructurally completely unprepared for it.
I instantly think of the devastating winter freezes that struck Texas recently. You had a situation where millions of people were caught entirely off guard.
A textbook example.
Right, like a massive deep trough developed in the jet stream, and it practically acted like a funnel, just dumping the polar vortex straight down into the American South.
That is exactly the mechanism. The cold air wasn't newly created out of nowhere. It simply escaped its Arctic containment because the westerlies became too wavy and weak to hold it back.
The human toll was catastrophic.
Yeah.
I mean, you had people literally freezing in their living rooms. The power grid completely failed because natural gas lines froze solid, which is something they were never designed to withstand in the southern state. Pipes burst in thousands of homes.
It was a disaster.
It was a direct, lethal result of this planetary fence breaking down and allowing the Arctic to bleed down into the subtropics.
It is a profound demonstration of how deeply we rely on the stability of these upper atmospheric rivers. But there is a flip side to this Rossby wave coin. If a deep trough pulls frigid air aggressively south, what is happening right next to it?
Well, if the wave goes down, it has to come back up somewhere else. So a high ridge must push air north. Does it drag tropical air into the north?
It does, but the danger isn't just the origin of the air. It is what the shape of the ridge does to the atmospheric pressure. When the jet stream bulges sharply north, it creates a massive, stagnant, high-pressure system underneath it.
Okay, stagnant high pressure.
This high pressure acts like an anvil. It pushes down heavily on the air below it toward the surface. As air is forced downward, it compresses. And
Yep.
basic physics dictates that when a gas compresses, it heats up.
So it's actively baking the air underneath it. It's not just moving hot air, it's creating it through compression.
Yes. Furthermore, this heavy downward pressure forces all moisture and clouds away from the region. The sky becomes perfectly clear, which allows the summer sun to bake the ground mercilessly. The ground heats up, radiates that heat back into the compressed air, and the cycle just intensifies.
People usually refer to this as a heat dome, right? Like you hear that in the news a lot now.
A heat dome is the perfect term. It forms an inescapable heat island. Because the jet stream has become weak and wobbly, it doesn't have the strength to push these weather systems along quickly. The high-pressure dome gets locked over a specific region for days or even weeks.
Just trapped.
The heat builds and builds, compounding daily, with absolutely no wind or rain allowed in to relieve it.
This perfectly explains the lethal heat waves we've been seeing ravage Europe, particularly the ones that struck Paris, France, so brutally a few years ago.
Yes, Paris is a prime example of this vulnerability.
You have these incredible historical cities filled with beautiful stone and zinc-roofed buildings, but stone absorbs and radiates heat. When a heat dome parked itself over Paris, there was no escape. The air stagnated entirely. The city literally became an oven. People were suffering from severe heat stroke, emergency rooms were overwhelmed, and there were mass casualties, especially among the elderly.
The listener needs to realize that the Earth uses these atmospheric flows to balance heat that the ocean currents simply cannot handle fast enough. The jet stream is, in a very real sense, the planet's atmospheric thermostat.
And it's breaking.
Right, and when you step outside and experience a sudden, brutal, pipe-bursting freeze in the dead of winter, or an agonizing stationary heat wave that bakes a city in the summer, you are not just experiencing bad weather, you are experiencing the mechanical failure of this planetary thermostat in real time.
Okay, so if the westerlies are these violent, high-altitude regulators swinging weather extremes across the mid-latitudes, what is balancing the heat at the surface? There has to be another giant gear turning closer to the equator to handle the direct onslaught of the sun.
There is, and its behavior is completely different from the chaotic wobbling of the jet stream. If we move away from the mid-latitudes and travel down toward the equator, specifically the zones between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, we enter a completely different atmospheric regime,
Okay, what's down there?
the trade winds.
Now, unlike the westerlies, which, as the name obviously implies, blow from west to east, the trade winds blow steadily from east to west. How does that happen if the Earth is still spinning the same way? Like, did the physics change?
It hasn't changed. It goes back to that massive Hadley cell circulation we discussed earlier. Remember, the air that rose at the equator traveled north, cooled down, and dropped back to the surface around 30 degrees latitude.
Right, the air that gets too heavy and falls back down.
Once it hits the surface, it gets pulled back toward the low-pressure void at the equator. So this air is now moving south along the surface of the Earth. But as it moves south, it is moving from a narrower part of the Earth back toward the widest part, the equator.
So now it's moving from land that is spinning at, say, 800 miles per hour toward land that is spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. It's the exact reverse of the westerlies.
Precisely. The surface beneath it is now accelerating eastward faster than the wind itself. So from the perspective of the ground, the wind is falling behind. The Coriolis effect deflects this southward moving air to the west. This creates a relentless, incredibly reliable wind system blowing from the east to the west across the tropics.
I want to touch on the name itself for a second, because the etymology of trade winds is entirely rooted in human economics and ambition. Like, during the Age of Discovery, European merchant ships sailing these massive, lumbering, square-rigged galleons absolutely relied on these steady easterly winds.
They were completely dependent on them.
Right, they were the only way to cross the vast, terrifying expanse of the Atlantic Ocean to reach the Americas. Without these winds blowing reliably from east to west, the transatlantic trade routes that defined early modern history simply would not have existed. They literally powered global commerce.
And in terms of planetary mechanics, they power the tropical climate. The trade winds are generally very different in character from the violent high-altitude jet stream. Down at the surface, they are usually calm, steady, and warm. They don't typically have that whipping, chaotic energy.
They seem much friendlier.
Usually, yes. However, they perform a massive critical function for the Earth, which is large-scale heat and moisture transfer.
I'm trying to visualize this. How does a gentle, steady breeze manage to transfer massive amounts of global heat? I mean, it's just a breeze.
You have to picture the sheer, mind-boggling scale of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. We are talking about thousands upon thousands of miles of open, unobstructed, warm, tropical water. As these warm trade winds sweep endlessly across these vast stretches of ocean, the friction of the wind against the water causes immense amounts of seawater to evaporate.
So it's drying out the top of the ocean.
Exactly. The moving air acts like a giant atmospheric sponge, absorbing unimaginable quantities of water vapor.
So it's not just moving air, it's moving millions of tons of invisible vaporized ocean water westward. It's a massive transport system for humidity.
Exactly. And evaporation requires energy. When liquid water turns into vapor, it absorbs heat from the ocean surface. So the trade winds are literally sucking heat out of the tropical oceans and storing it in the air as latent energy.
That is fascinating.
Now, consider what happens when this incredibly moist, warm, energy-dense air finally hits a landmass, like the thousands of islands of Indonesia or the equatorial continents.
I would assume that hitting land changes the dynamic completely, especially under the blazing equatorial sun.
It is a violent disruption. The landmasses heat up much faster than the ocean under the intense tropical sun. The ground gets blazing hot, which severely heats the air immediately above it. This causes powerful, rapid thermal updrafts.
So it forces the air straight up.
Yes, all that moisture-laden air that the trade winds have been carrying for thousands of miles is violently shoved upward into the colder, higher parts of the atmosphere.
And cold air can't hold as much moisture as warm air.
Right. As it rises and cools, all that invisible water vapor rapidly condenses. It forms massive, towering cumulonimbus clouds, and then the bottom just falls out.
This is where you get those legendary tropical squalls. Sudden, massive, incredibly localized downpours. Anyone who has spent time in the tropics knows it's not a gentle drizzle that lasts all day. It's a sudden deluge where the sky just unzips and dumps water for an hour, and then the sun comes back out.
This cycle is the Earth's primary cooling system in action. By turning liquid water into vapor over the ocean, the Earth absorbs heat. By blowing that vapor over land, lifting it up, and condensing it back into rain, the Earth releases all that stored heat high up in the atmosphere, where it can easily radiate out into space. The subsequent cold rain then falls and physically cools the equatorial land masses.
I think of it exactly like the human body sweating. Like when we exert ourselves and get hot, our bodies produce sweat on our skin, the sweat evaporates, and that phase change pulls heat away from our bodies, cooling us down.
That's a really good way to look at it.
The planet is doing the exact same thing on a macro scale. It's moving heat from the ocean surface, transporting it via the trade winds, lifting it high into the atmosphere, and releasing it through these massive tropical rainstorms. It's what keeps the equator from just boiling over and becoming a sterile, uninhabitable desert.
That is a very accurate way to frame it. The trade winds are the conveyor belt for the Earth's sweat. But, as with all complex, interlocking systems, this conveyor belt has vulnerabilities. It is not invincible.
Which brings up a really terrifying scenario. If the upper atmosphere's jet stream has a breaking point when it gets too wavy, what is the breaking point for the trade winds? What happens if they get too calm?
That is the crucial question. What happens when this giant planetary conveyor belt just stops?
I assume the entire system backs up.
It does, and it triggers a phenomenon known as El Niño. To understand the chaos of El Niño, we first have to look at what the trade winds are doing to the ocean water itself. Normally, as they blow steadily from east to west across the Pacific, they physically drag the warm surface water with them.
Just dragging it along the top.
Right. This causes a massive pool of warm water to pile up in the western Pacific near Indonesia and Australia.
Kind of like pushing water to one end of a bathtub.
Yes, exactly like that. And because all that surface water is being pushed west, it leaves a void on the eastern side of the Pacific, off the coast of South America. To fill that void, freezing cold, nutrient-rich water wells up from the deep ocean abyss to the surface.
Oh, that's upwelling.
Right, this upwelling creates one of the most productive marine ecosystems on the planet off the coast of Peru, supporting massive, massive fisheries. This is the normal, healthy state of affairs.
But the atmosphere's fickle. Every few years, this whole setup just collapses, right?
For reasons atmospheric scientists are still constantly working to fully model and predict, the pressure gradients shift and the trade winds simply weaken. Sometimes they stop altogether or even briefly reverse direction.
Well, if the wind stops pushing the water to the west, gravity is going to take over. That massive pile of warm water in the western Pacific must just collapse and slosh back eastward across the ocean toward South America.
It acts like a slow-motion tidal wave of heat. The ocean's entire thermal distribution gets completely scrambled. The cold upwelling off the coast of South America shuts down entirely because it's capped by this incoming warm water.
Which means the nutrients stop flowing and the marine food web collapses. I've read about historical accounts where millions of fish and the birds that feed on them just die off the coast of Peru during a strong El Niño. Like, the beaches are just covered in dead animals.
The ecological devastation is massive. But because the ocean and the atmosphere are locked together in this thermodynamic dance, when the ocean's heat moves, the global weather follows it. The warm water that usually creates those cooling squalls over Indonesia is now sitting in the middle of the Pacific.
Because the rain moves with the heat. So places like Australia and Indonesia, which rely on that constant moisture, are suddenly left bone dry.
They experience devastating, prolonged droughts. This is the exact mechanism that dries out the Australian bush and sets the stage for those catastrophic, continent-spanning wildfires we see during El Niño years.
All connected.
And meanwhile, the west coast of South America, regions like the Atacama Desert, which are usually some of the driest places on Earth, suddenly get hit with torrential, catastrophic flooding because the storm-generating warm water is now parked right off their coast.
It's an entire planetary role reversal. And I imagine this heat displacement in the tropics messes with the westerlies up north, too.
Absolutely. The massive release of heat in the central Pacific alters the path of the jet stream, displacing it from its normal flow. This can cause bizarre, extreme winter storms in North America, dumping snow in places that rarely see it, or causing unusual warm spells in the dead of winter. The failure of just one wind system at the equator cascades through the entire planetary gear system.
So a lack of trade winds causes global droughts and floods. But even when the trade winds are functioning perfectly, they hide a completely different kind of monster. We think of them as calm, but they are also the birthplace of the most violent storms on Earth.
They are the nursery for typhoons and hurricanes. To understand why, we need to look at the exact meteorological equator. It is not necessarily the geographic equator, but a shifting line called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ.
Okay, what exactly is converging there?
The trade winds from both hemispheres. The Earth has northeast trade winds in the northern hemisphere and southeast trade winds in the southern hemisphere. Because they are both being pulled toward the low-pressure void at the equator, they eventually meet.
Like a head-on collision.
Exactly. The ITCZ is the physical line where these two massive global conveyor belts crash into each other head-on.
If you have two planetary-scale wind systems colliding, I'd expect it to be this permanent, violent hurricane zone. But usually it just looks like a band of heavy clouds on satellite imagery.
While the surface winds themselves might feel relatively calm or variable as they collide and push upward, the sheer amount of latent heat and moisture pooling in this convergence zone is staggering. Because the air has nowhere to go but up, it forms a near-continuous band of thunderstorms wrapped around the Earth. It is a massive powder keg of atmospheric energy. Most of the time, this energy just bleeds off slowly as those scattered thunderstorms and squalls we discussed.
But sometimes the conditions align perfectly, and that energy focuses.
Exactly. If a small atmospheric disturbance, a low-pressure wave rolls through this convergence zone, and the ocean water below is exceptionally warm, providing maximum evaporation, that scattered, chaotic thunderstorm activity begins to organize around a central pivot point.
This is where the spin of the Earth comes back into play, isn't it? Even though the Coriolis effect is very weak near the equator, it must be just enough to give this cluster of storms a nudge.
It imparts just enough rotational spin. As the rising air creates an intense low pressure center, surrounding air rushes in to fill it. But because of the Coriolis deflection, the air spirals inward rather than flowing straight in. The system starts rotating.
And once it starts rotating, it essentially becomes a giant engine.
It becomes a self-sustaining thermodynamic machine. It feeds on the endless heat and moisture provided by the trade winds, drawing energy up from the warm ocean like a massive vacuum cleaner.
Just sucking up all that fuel.
Right. The condensing water vapor releases immense amounts of latent heat, which forces the air to rise even faster, lowering the pressure further, which sucks in more wind, increasing the spin.
And suddenly, that calm, tropical breeze, organized by a tiny disturbance, has exploded into a Category 5 typhoon or hurricane, a monstrous spinning cyclone of destruction hundreds of miles wide, capable of leveling entire coastlines and dropping feet of rain in a matter of hours.
The trade winds gather the fuel over thousands of miles. The ITCZ provides the spark by forcing the air upward, and planetary physics spin it into a monster.
It is truly staggering to synthesize all of this. When you step back and look at the whole picture, you have these deep water ocean upwellings, combined with these giant rivers of air, the violent snaking westerlies keeping the poles in check, the wobbly jet stream dropping winter freezes, the massive moisture-laden trade winds acting as a global cooling system.
They really are all just interlocking gears.
It really feels like we are looking at the circulatory and respiratory systems controlling the body temperature of a living, breathing planet.
That is the perfect way to view the Earth sciences. And for millions of years, this grand mechanical system operated entirely independently of human beings. But that brings us to a crucial pivot in our narrative today.
Right, the history part.
Knowing that these winds exist is one thing. Navigating them, surviving them, and eventually conquering them to build global civilizations, that is an entirely different story.
This is where we shift from natural science to human history. Let's travel back in time to the ancient Indian Ocean. This was really the birthplace of some of the earliest, most complex, and most lucrative long-distance maritime trade in human history.
Absolutely.
We are talking about ancient Indian, Arab, and Persian merchants navigating these waters centuries before Europe even entered the global maritime scene.
And these early mariners understood the trade winds implicitly. Specifically, they mastered the seasonal monsoon winds, which are a regional variation of the trade winds driven by the massive heating and cooling of the Asian continent.
They realized that nature provided a free transit system. Like if you wanted to sail from the Arabian Peninsula or the east coast of Africa across the ocean to India to trade for highly valuable spices, textiles, and gems, you didn't have to row.
No, rowing across an ocean with cargo isn't really an option.
Right, you just waited for the right time of year, hoisted a sail, and the monsoon trade winds provided a perfect, effortless tailwind. The planetary conveyor belt literally pushed you directly to the market.
It was incredibly efficient for outbound travel, but they faced a massive existential problem once they arrived. How do you get back home?
Right, because the very wind that brought you there, this massive planetary force that you cannot fight with oars, is now blowing directly in your face. It's a one-way street.
Exactly. For centuries, the only technological solution to this problem was patience. You sailed to India on the summer monsoon, and then you just sat there in a foreign port for half a year.
That sounds miserable for business.
You had to wait for the planetary seasons to change, for the Asian continent to cool down, and for the monsoon winds to completely reverse direction so you could catch a tailwind back to Arabia or Africa.
That is a staggering logistical bottleneck. It ties up immense amounts of capital, leaves merchants stranded away from their families for months, and severely limits the pace and volume of global trade. They were entirely at the mercy of the planetary gears. If the Earth said wait 6 months, you waited 6 months.
Until a technological breakthrough fundamentally changed the relationship between humans and the atmosphere.
I am so excited to talk about this part because it is one of my favorite historical innovations.
Oh.
I'm talking about the invention of the triangle sail, more formally known in maritime history as the lateen sail.
Yes, a game changer.
It was originally mounted on incredibly agile ships called dhows, pioneered right there in the Indian Ocean.
To appreciate the lateen sail, we really have to understand what it replaced. Before this, ships in the Mediterranean and Northern Europe almost exclusively used square sails. Think of a classic Viking longship or a Roman merchant vessel.
Right, the big blocky sails.
A square sail is basically just a giant, heavy canvas parachute. It catches the wind from behind and physically pushes the ship forward.
So it relies entirely on drag.
Exactly. It is fantastic for going directly downwind, but if the wind shifts and is coming at you from the side, or, God forbid, blowing directly from the front, a square sail is worse than useless. It will simply blow your ship backward or catch the wind on the wrong side and capsize the vessel entirely.
So a square sail completely traps you on nature's conveyor belt. How does turning the sail into a triangle change that? Like, explain the mechanics of this to someone who has never been on a sailboat. How does a taut piece of triangular fabric let you sail into the wind? It sounds like you are defying physics.
It feels like magic, but it doesn't defy physics. It leverages a completely different branch of it, which is aerodynamics. A lateen sail is a large triangular sail mounted at an angle on a very long yardarm. Because of its triangular shape and the specific way it is rigged to the mast, sailors can pull the fabric incredibly tight and angle it sharply against the oncoming wind.
Okay, so the wind is hitting it at a sharp angle, not flat on like a parachute.
Right. When you angle a taut triangle sail into the wind, it stops acting like a parachute dragging you forward and it starts acting exactly like an airplane wing turned on its side.
Oh, it utilizes the Bernoulli principle to generate lift.
Precisely. As the oncoming wind flows over the curved surface of the angled sail, the air traveling on the outside curve has to move faster than the air on the inside curve to reach the back edge at the same time. Fast-moving air creates lower pressure.
Okay, so you have high pressure on one side of the sail pushing and low pressure on the other side pulling.
Exactly. This pressure differential generates a force called forward lift. The sail literally pulls the ship forward and slightly sideways into the wind. The hull of the ship, cutting deep into the water, resists the sideways motion, which translates all that lift into forward momentum.
That is absolutely brilliant engineering. But obviously, you can't point the front of the ship dead straight into a headwind, right? Because the sail would just flap like a flag.
Correct. There is a no-go zone directly into the wind where the sail just luffs. But by using the lateen sail, a skilled captain could saddle at a sharp angle, say 45 degrees against the oncoming wind. You sail forward and to the left at a 45-degree angle for a while. Then you manually flip the massive sail to the other side of the mast and you sail forward and to the right at a 45-degree angle.
Oh, I see. You zigzag your way up the ocean.
The proper maritime term is tacking. By zigzagging back and forth, a ship equipped with a lateen sail could systematically work its way directly upwind, completely defying the directional flow of the trade winds.
This is a monumental leap for humanity. This is the exact moment in history when humans stopped being passive passengers on nature's conveyor belts. They hacked the wind. They figured out how to use the wind zone energy against it to go wherever they wanted.
And the cultural transmission of this technology is a fascinating story of globalization long before the modern era. The lateen sail didn't stay isolated in the Indian Ocean. Ideas and technology always travel with the cargo.
So who adopted it next?
The Indian Ocean merchants shared these trading routes with Islamic mariners and traders from the Arabian Peninsula. The Islamic sailors immediately recognized the vast superiority of the lateen sail, especially for navigating the tricky, shifting, unpredictable winds of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, where a square sail would be a death trap.
So they adopted it and spread it.
Yes, they adopted the technology, scaled it up, and brought it with them as their empires expanded westward into the Mediterranean Sea.
Which means it inching closer to Europe.
It was a direct collision of cultures. During the Crusades, European navies and merchants came into sustained and often violent contact with Islamic fleets in the Mediterranean. The Europeans, who were still largely relying on heavy, clunky, square-rigged ships, saw these incredibly nimble, agile Islamic corsairs and merchant galleys darting around, sailing into the wind, outmaneuvering them effortlessly.
It must have looked like alien technology to a European sailor stuck rowing or just waiting around for a tailwind.
The Europeans quickly realized they were completely outclassed. They absorbed this technology. The lateen sail became a critical maritime asset, essentially a prize of war and trade, brought back and studied in the great naval shipyards of Italy, Spain, and Portugal.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the grand finale of our historical narrative today. The ultimate wind hack, the Volta du Mar, and the climax of the Age of Discovery. So let's paint the picture. It is the 15th century. Europe now possesses the lateen sail technology. They understand the aerodynamics of tacking. But geographically and economically, they are totally trapped.
To understand the desperation of the Age of Discovery, you have to look at the map from the perspective of the Kingdom of Portugal. Prince Henry the Navigator and his ambitious captains are absolutely desperate to find a direct sea route to the unbelievable wealth of the Indian Ocean. The spices, the silks, the gems that were making Venice and the Ottoman Empire incredibly rich.
Because the Ottoman Empire firmly controls all the overland routes to Asia, and they are taxing the Europeans heavily. Portugal has to find a way to bypass them by sea.
And looking at a map, the route seems obvious. Just sail south, down the West African coast, get around the bottom of the African continent, and sail up into the Indian Ocean.
But there is a massive, invisible planetary barrier standing in their way.
The northeast trade winds.
Exactly. As Portuguese explorers gingerly tried to hug the West African coast and push their ships south into uncharted waters, they ran face first into the relentless trade winds blowing aggressively from the northeast.
And we must remember the flaw of the traditional European ship design at this time. While they had started to incorporate small lateen sails on the back masts to help with steering, their main driving force was still massive, square sails on the main masts.
So they were still pretty clunky.
Very. They were sailing heavy, lumbering, deep draft vessels designed for hauling heavy cargo in the North Atlantic, not for agile upwind tacking in treacherous, shallow coastal waters.
So even with a little triangular sail on the back, they couldn't just zigzag their way down the massive coast of Africa.
They couldn't. Every time a Portuguese captain tried to hug the African coast and muscle his way south, the northeast trade winds would catch their bulky square rigging. The wind physically pushed them away from the safety of the coast, blowing them out westward into the terrifying, vast, uncharted open ocean of the Central Atlantic.
I really can't overstate how terrifying that must have been for a 15th century sailor. Like, to them, the open Atlantic was literally called the Sea of Darkness. It was a void of sea monsters and boiling waters. The psychological terror of being blown out of sight of land was just immense.
They were convinced they would fall off the edge of the world or just slowly die of thirst.
Exactly. The prevailing belief was you get blown out there, you die, and you don't come back.
Mm.
So for decades, the Portuguese were geographically and psychologically paralyzed by this wind barrier. They would inch south, get battered by the trade winds, panic, and just be forced to retreat home.
They were stuck. But then, through generations of trial, error, and meticulous record-keeping, the Portuguese navigators made a conceptual, intellectual leap that changed the entire world. They stopped stubbornly fighting the wind, and they started using the planet's atmospheric macrostructure to their advantage.
This is the genius part.
They developed a brilliant, counterintuitive navigational strategy called the Volta do Mar, which translates beautifully from Portuguese as the turn of the sea.
This is where understanding global atmospheric circulation literally paid off in empires. How did the Volta do Mar actually work in practice, like out on the water?
The Portuguese mariners, through observation, realized that the trade winds were not just a localized freak weather phenomenon off the coast of Africa. They deduced that these winds were part of a massive circular planetary system. They theorized that if the wind blew strongly from the northeast near Africa, constantly pushing them west, there must be a counterwind further out in the deep ocean or further north to balance the atmospheric system.
They figured out the Hadley cell without having satellites or modern physics. That's incredible. They combined their newly mastered Latin sail technology with this brilliant theoretical understanding of the atmosphere.
Exactly. The execution of the Volta do Mar required immense courage. Instead of hugging the coast and fighting the trade winds directly south, a captain would take his ship and deliberately turn west. He would sail directly away from Africa into the terrifying open ocean, letting the trade winds push him far out into the deep Atlantic.
It sounds completely insane to the crew, like our destination is south, so the captain is sailing us straight west into the Sea of Darkness.
It was a massive leap of faith. Mutinies were a real threat, but they sailed west and north in a massive arc until they finally escaped the grip of the trade winds and entered the mid-latitudes. And what did they find waiting for them out there in the open ocean?
The westerlies, the high-speed planetary fence we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive.
They found the relentless winds blowing west to east. Once they hit this zone, they would turn their ships, catch these powerful westerlies, and ride that giant atmospheric loop all the way back east, aiming for a point much, much further south down the African coast.
I have to bring up an analogy here because it feels like something ripped straight out of modern science fiction. The Volta do Mar is exactly like a gravitational slingshot maneuver used in space exploration.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Like when NASA wants to send a heavy probe to the outer solar system, like to Jupiter or Saturn, they don't point the rocket straight at the target. They don't have enough fuel for that. Instead, they shoot the probe toward a closer planet like Venus, that the planet's massive gravity will grab the probe, swing it around, and slingshot it outward with massive acceleration.
Gaining free momentum.
The Portuguese navigators did the exact same thing, but with atmospheric currents instead of gravity. They sailed away from their destination to catch a high-speed planetary current that would slingshot them back exactly where they needed to go.
That is a brilliant analogy. It was literally an atmospheric slingshot maneuver. By mastering the Volta do Mar and equipped with hybrid ships like the Caravel that strategically combined square sails for raw speed and Latin triangle sails for maneuverability, they finally shattered the equatorial barrier. They bypassed the invisible wall that had kept Europe boxed in for centuries.
They successfully navigated down the endless coastline of the African continent. And the culmination of this effort happened in 1488, when the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias executed this Volta do Mar maneuver perfectly. He sailed deep into the Atlantic, broke past the trade winds, caught the roaring westerlies, and was pushed violently but successfully all the way around the southern tip of Africa.
He rounded the Cape of Good Hope.
Breaking through this wind system opened the direct sea route from Europe to the immense riches of the Indian Ocean. It was the great turning point in global history. It permanently united the previously isolated oceans and continents of the world into a single, cohesive maritime network, triggering the absolute climax of the Age of Discovery.
It was the birth of true modern globalization. And it wasn't achieved just through political will, military might, or economic desire. It was achieved by reverse engineering the Earth's atmospheric physics.
Which brings us perfectly to our conclusion.
Yeah.
As we promised at the start, honoring the listener Hatho Theatha who inspired this entire deep dive, it is time to lock in all this knowledge so you never forget it. We are putting 3 minutes on the clock for Hatho Theatha's 3-minute summary. Are you ready for a rapid-fire breakdown?
I am ready. Let's recap the planetary mechanics and the history.
Go.
We started high in the atmosphere with the violent westerlies. Because the Earth's waistline spins much faster at the equator than it does at the poles, rising hot equatorial air trying to rush north is drastically deflected to the east by the Coriolis effect, creating relentless west-to-east winds.
Right, the jet stream.
These high-altitude winds form massive, wavy rivers known as the jet stream, or Rossby waves. When these atmospheric waves are tight and fast, they act as a fence, trapping frigid Arctic air in the north. But as climate change warms the poles, the temperature gap narrows, and the jet stream wobbles out of control. Deep troughs pull freezing air down to cause catastrophic winter freezes like we saw in Texas, while high ridges trap hot air underneath them, creating lethal heat domes that bake cities like in Paris.
Boom. Then we drop down to the equator to examine the trade winds. Blowing steadily from east to west, these winds are the Earth's primary cooling system. They sweep across the vast tropical oceans, acting like massive sponges, soaking up millions of tons of water vapor. When they hit hot land masses, this moisture is violently forced upward, condensing and unleashing massive tropical squalls, essentially, the Earth sweating to cool itself off.
But they have a dark side.
Right. If these winds weaken or stop, the ocean's stored heat sloshes backward across the Pacific, triggering the global climate chaos, droughts, and floods of El Niño. And where the northern and southern trade winds physically collide, they form the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a powder keg of heat and moisture that can organize and spin up into devastating Category 5 typhoons and hurricanes.
Finally, we connected this grand physical machine to human triumph. For centuries, ancient Indian Ocean sailors used the trade winds for transport, but were trapped waiting for planetary seasons to change just to return home. They solved this geographic prison by inventing the lateen or triangle sail. By acting exactly like an airplane wing, the lateen sail provided aerodynamic lift, allowing ships to zigzag or tack directly against headwinds.
And then that spread to Europe.
This crucial technology passed through the Islamic world to Europe. When Portuguese explorers were trapped by the northeast trade winds pushing them away from Africa, they used this technology to invent the Volta do Mar. They deliberately sailed west into the deep, terrifying open ocean to escape the trade winds and catch the westerlies, using the planet's atmospheric loops as a massive slingshot to round the Cape of Good Hope, access the Indian Ocean, and permanently connect the globe.
And time. That was an incredible summary. So to everyone listening, I hope you now understand exactly how the physical spinning of the Earth directly created the wind patterns that led to the globalization of human civilization. The weather is history, and history is weather. You really can't separate them.
It is a remarkable testament to human ingenuity and our ability to adapt to our environment. But as we wrap up, this reflection on history raises an important, deeply provocative question, one that we absolutely must consider as we look to the future.
Lay it on us. What are we facing next?
We spent today talking about how ancient humans used brilliant technology and courage to conquer ancient, incredibly reliable wind patterns. The Volta do Mar relied on the atmosphere being predictable, but we also discussed how those foundational patterns are currently changing.
Because of the warming.
Right. As climate change drastically and rapidly warms the poles, it is permanently altering the mechanics of the jet stream, making those upper atmospheric rivers wilder, weaker, and far less predictable. Simultaneously, shifting ocean surface temperatures threaten to weaken or permanently alter the historical flow of the trade winds, making phenomena like El Niño more frequent and severe.
Oh, wow.
So the thought I want to leave everyone with is this. If the very atmospheric rivers that built our globalized world fundamentally change their course, will our modern shipping routes, our global agricultural belts, and our fragile, highly interconnected economy need to invent a brand new Volta do Mar just to survive the 21st century?
Wow. That is a chilling but absolutely essential thought to chew on. Like, we mapped the winds once to build a modern world, and it seems we might have to figure out how to map a completely new sky in the near future. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sky and into our shared history. I highly encourage you to walk outside tomorrow, look up at those supposedly peaceful, quiet clouds, and recognize the massive world-building gears turning right above your head. Until next time, keep looking up and keep diving deep.
Thank you for listening.